Hello, and welcome to the Skillful podcast, where we explore DBT and RODBT skills to help you reduce emotional suffering, improve your relationships, and become more present in your life. I'm your host, Marielle Berg, a psychotherapist at the Bay Area DBT and Couples Counseling Center. So welcome back, Ed.
Thank you.
I am really excited for today because we're going to be unpacking 10 common myths about emotions. And we wanted to talk about this today because so often difficulties in managing emotions are related to these common myths that a lot of folks believe or are raised with.
Yeah, I think that we don't tend to have a lot of discussion about what emotions are, what their purpose is, how to deal with them, and so it's very easy, especially starting as children, to develop ideas about emotions that are never discussed or challenged. And sometimes those ideas are actually myths that aren't so accurate, and it's helpful to think them through a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that unless they're named, oftentimes people don't know, and myself included, that we're believing these things. And so it's helpful to sort of spell them out and check in with ourselves to be like, oh, how much do I believe this is true? Where did I learn this?
Right.
Sometimes these things are taught really explicitly in families. Like it's not okay to be emotional in public, or
Right.
it's always better to stuff down your emotions. And sometimes it's just modeled for us.
Right. We just pick it up.
Yeah. So let's delve in right away with our first myth, which is having strong emotions means I am out of control. This is such a common one where strong emotions are equated with loss of control. So the truth about this is that all of us can feel deeply and not be out of control. And the out of control part comes not from the emotion or feeling itself, but from actions that come with the emotions. And oftentimes people conflate the two because they feel something really strongly and then it's quickly followed by some kind of impulsive or perhaps self-destructive behavior or an addictive kind of behavior. And then the two things get sort of coupled. I have a strong emotion, automatically I'm out of control.
Right. And I think that comes because if we have strong emotions when we're young and start to cope with them with ways that don't really work and feel out of control, we're just going to keep practicing that until we learn something new. And so it can seem that there is a connection there. Strong emotions equal whatever the behavior is after the emotion. And one of the things I appreciate about DBT is being able to separate those. That the emotion is one thing, that what we do is a totally different thing. And we have more ability to manage what we do if we're thoughtful about it.
Yes. And with that thoughtfulness, it allows us to let the strong emotion be there, which can be quite physical. Oftentimes strong emotions, they all have a physical correlate. So intense anger can be felt, in our limbs, in our jaws, maybe behind the eyes. Our heart rate may go up. We might find ourselves breathing more shallowly. So it can be very physical. But that part is not out of control. It may feel super intense, but it's, I was saying a moment ago, it's the action. It's the taking action on the emotion that leads to the out of control feeling.
Right. So that ability to feel emotions and let them be there before acting is so valuable and takes so much practice to get there.
Yeah. And it's a practice and part of being with discomfort because it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And trusting that the emotion, this is not a myth I think we're going to have time to talk about today, but the emotion's not going to kill us and we don't have to act on it.
Right. Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
Yeah. Do you want to have us move on to a second myth?
Yeah. So then a second myth would be, if I start crying, I will never stop, which kind of is related to that idea that emotions followed by actions are automatic. So for instance, if we've had the experience of feeling deep sadness and just crying and crying, then we can feel like, yeah, I'll never stop crying. I think more often, if we really pay attention, if we have deep sadness, or sometimes for people, if they feel angry, they'll start crying. And it feels like it goes on forever. We never stop. And the reality is, we always stop crying. At some point, we stop crying, right? And
Yes.
oftentimes sooner than we think, than we necessarily notice that we've
Yeah.
stopped, we've moved on to another emotion. And this is like a total myth, that if I have an emotion or if I start crying, I'll never stop, when we stop eventually under all
Yes.
circumstances, right? And so being able to remind ourselves that whatever emotion I'm feeling right now, if it's making me cry or if it's making me angry, if it's really filling me with all sorts of physical sensations, this will pass. This will
Yes.
pass. And DBT gives us lots of things to do while we wait for it to pass. I think the starting point is acknowledging, I will not feel this forever.
Yes. Recognizing that all emotions sort of have their lifespan, and they pass. They may come back, but they do pass through us. And I feel like I've heard some variation of, if I start crying, I will never stop, so many times. If I had a nickel for every time I heard
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I think that, like, I've certainly felt that, like, oh my God, if I let myself feel sad, I'll get stuck in it and I'll never get out of
Yeah.
it, right? If I let myself feel angry, I won't be able to get out of it and I'll be stuck. And I think that comes from not knowing what to do if we're feeling strong emotions. And so, yeah, we do feel stuck because we don't know what to do. For
Yes.
me now, knowing whatever emotion I have will pass, I still can get into that thinking of, like, oh my gosh, if I let myself start crying, I'll never stop. But I'm much quicker to be able to be like, no, like, if I let myself cry, it will come and go. Like,
Yes.
crying actually will help the crying to stop.
Absolutely. It will help the crying to move through. I
Right.
think so often when people say, if I start crying, it will never stop, they're really talking about this fear of their own grief or sadness. And like, if I take the lid off this, it will just overflow and there's no end to it.
Right.
And it can feel like that. And certainly grief can sometimes feel like that,
Right.
but it gets compounded by trying to push it down.
Right.
And then when we try to repress something, it doesn't go away. It just
Right.
sort of builds in the intensity.
Right.
And so, related to this, or with when people believe that if I start crying, I will never stop, that can lead to a whole host of ways of avoiding grief and sadness, all the different functional and not so functional ways we might try to avoid feelings. And we could say this probably for all our emotions, for all the way from, overworking or oversleeping to, zoning out in front of the computer. These are all ways that we can sort of numb ourselves to these intense emotions. And this is related. I'll go into the next one, since I'm talking about ways to numb ourselves, which certainly we can all do with grief and sadness. But another one where there can be a fear that the emotion will be too much, is our next myth, which is, I need to push down my anger or it will become dangerous. Similar to the myth we were talking about a moment ago with sadness, anger also has a lifespan. It builds and it can feel very intense in the body in particular. There can be a lot of energy there. But if we let it move through us, it will dissipate. We can do things like thinking like, if we're angry at a coworker, and so we can feel really intense anger. Maybe we want to lash out, but we choose not to. We let the anger ride through us, and then we're feeling a little better, and then we start replaying that conversation with our coworker in our mind. The anger comes back up again. So there are ways that we can reactivate the emotion, but the anger in and of itself isn't dangerous.
Right. And I think that's, again, the idea that whatever the behavior is that follows an emotion is completely tied to the emotion itself, is such a huge myth, right? So we can
Yeah.
feel angry and not act on it in a dangerous way. That's possible, right? And if we've had experiences of being really angry and getting out of control in a way that was hurtful to ourselves or to other people, then it makes sense that we'd be afraid of that.
Yeah.
I think when we can notice the feeling, notice the emotion, and take a step back and just let it be, and choose how we want to respond, choose what we do, then we can have less fear that our emotions will be overwhelming or dangerous.
Yeah. I think what you said a moment ago was like we could say over and over and really needs to be highlighted. And I can't remember exactly how you said it, but you can be angry and have it not lead to a destructive action.
Yeah.
Because for so many people, because they've had the experience of being angry themselves and lashing out in some way, or being on the receiving end of someone else's anger, especially a parent who was angry while the person was young, anger can be coupled with really scary behaviors.
Right. Right. And again, I think that myths are often the extremes. And there's some truth. Anger can be dangerous. And I think many of us have had the experience of having someone be angry in a way that was threatening or dangerous to us. We've had the experience of having our
Yes.
anger overwhelm us in a way that was dangerous, right? But it's not always. It's not every time.
Hmm.
And certainly we have a
Yeah.
lot of power over how we handle our own anger. We just need to know what
Hmm.
our options are. When we don't know options, then yeah, it is
Yes.
overwhelming. But when we know what we might do when we notice the anger, then it doesn't have to become overwhelming or dangerous.
Yeah. And with anger, I also like to think about, because this isn't talked about very often, that there's something to be learned from our anger. If we can be with it and not have it lead us to complete overwhelm or to acting out in ways that we're going to later regret. There's something our anger often is trying to tell us. Maybe a boundary has been crossed or there's some action that
Right.
we need to
I
take.
think we're going to get into this as we go along, but emotions give us important, valuable information that we can't get in other ways. And so if I'm feeling angry, something has happened, and I need to kind of look at what that is.
Yes. Yeah.
So, our fourth myth about emotions is if I am feeling very emotional, I must do something to change it. And I think it comes back to the idea that if I'm feeling really strong emotions, they're going to overwhelm me. I need to make them go away. I have to do something to make this emotion go away. And if we don't know what to do when we're feeling different emotions, if I'm feeling really intense guilt, or if I'm feeling really intense anger or sadness, whatever it might be, if I don't know what to do to deal with it, then yeah, I'm going to want to change it and make this emotion go away. When the reality is that, again, emotions are telling us something. So sitting with it and trying to understand, what is this emotion telling me? What kind of information is it giving me for what to do next? Then we don't necessarily need to change the emotion, right? But if we don't, if it's just like, oh my God, I feel so guilty, this feels awful, let me make this go away, let me change this, I have to do something to change this right now, that's where we can make the emotion kind of get stuck or do like take
Yeah.
some action that then we regret. So we felt guilty and then we, use some kind of compulsive behavior to change it, but then we felt ashamed of doing that. So we're
Right.
just
Yeah.
running away from those emotions. So, with all of these myths, having the capacity to sit with it and learn from it and consciously choose our actions is very different than just doing anything we have to do to avoid the emotion.
Yes. As we're talking about this myth, I'm thinking about a rubber band and how it can expand. And that when we're trying to learn to expand our emotional capacity, it's a similar kind of thing where we have more depth or stretch. I don't know what word I want to use within us than we often realize to hold strong
Right.
emotion and not necessarily to rush to change it or try to fix it, but to let it live inside until we figure out if or figure out what we want
Right.
to do, if anything, because sometimes there isn't
Right.
something to do around it. And I think the mindfulness skills that we teach in DBT can be really helpful for being with some of the strong emotion. So the observe and the describe helps us sort of take a step back and just name what we're feeling without that urgency to make it go away or
Right.
change it immediately. And that leads us to our fifth myth, which is reason is better than emotion. Or another way of saying this is it's always better to be rational than emotional. So the truth is, we really need our emotions. They can make us react quickly in the face of danger. They make us reach out to those in need, and they motivate us to form intimate relationships. So, some of that, even though we're talking about the more impulsive behaviors that come with strong emotions, some of that is really helpful. If we see a baby crying left alone on a street corner, we're probably going to rush up to it and try to get help for that baby. So, or any other kind of dangerous things. If we see a child, in a crosswalk of a street, we're going to try to push them out of, danger's way. So there are things about our emotions and being able to react quickly that we absolutely need for our own survival and for our survival as a species. And if we didn't have emotions, then we wouldn't form intimate relationships. So if people are only living in their rational minds or put a high premium on rationality and being reasonable, it's really difficult to form intimacy with others.
And when we talk about these myths in group, like I get the idea that, like, oh my gosh, I would love to just not be emotional at all and be able to just be reasonable all the time. Because, when we talk about the, reasonable mind versus emotion mind, when we are looking at our wise mind concept, reasonable mind is very cool. It's factual, right? And emotion mind is hot and, and impassioned. And so when emotions are strong, it can feel to us like, oh my gosh, reason is so much better. Why can't I always just be factual and cool, right?
Uh-huh.
The reality is we need both.
Because
There
it's boring.
I mean, again, in the
Judgment.
moment, that's a judgment. Yeah. In the moment, it sounds great, but we would be so bored.
Yeah.
Right? If it's just like, oh, let me reasonably think about whether I want to eat this thing or not, right?
Uh-huh.
There's like a certain amount of being able to like use our emotions to figure out what to do.
Yeah.
And there are extreme examples, like if, like a car is coming at us and the emotion to run, just kind of fills us, and where our fear is like so intense and we run, then we're going to avoid getting hit by that car, right?
Mhm.
We're not going to be able to sit there and reasonably think, oh, that car seems to be going very fast. I wonder what I should do, right? And so in those extremes, emotions are life-saving in a way.
Yes. Yeah.
But in any circumstance, emotions just are. Like we're born with emotions. We have emotions. Being able to understand them, being able to notice them, recognize them, and have a sense of what to do to respond to them makes emotions less scary. And therefore, we don't feel like, oh, I don't want these emotions at all. I just want to be reasonable all the time.
Yeah. I think about how, and so many folks, when they come into our group, and I totally get it, when we talk about reasonable mind versus emotion mind and wise mind, there's people think, oh, the solution is to just be in reasonable mind all the time, because there's a way that the pendulum has swung too far to one side.
Right.
So they might be too much in emotion mind, and that it's hard to live that way, and it causes a lot of problems. They're like, oh, I want to swing the other way and be in reason the only all the time. But as we just talked about, that we can't, and we need emotions, and we would not connect to other people. We would not have relationships if we didn't have emotions.
Right. Right. Again, sometimes that sounds really great.
Let's
if
not have
our
any emotions.
if our relationships are feeling like overwhelming in some way, it's like, yeah, let's not have emotions. But again, we would be so bored, and that's not reality. So
Yeah, bored and I think and lonely.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So another myth, the sixth myth that we want to talk about today, is that emotions can just happen for no reason. And this goes back to the idea that emotions are just a thing that happens that becomes overwhelming, and there's nothing we can do about. And the reality is that emotions are always a response to something. We are built as human beings with emotions to have the capacity to respond to things that goes beyond our reasonable abilities. And so being able to recognize I'm having a really strong emotion, it seems to be coming out of nowhere. Well, it's not coming out of nowhere. This emotion is a response to something. What is it that I'm responding to?
Yeah.
So sometimes we can feel really angry and not know why. And it's because we had like a really fleeting thought about something where our limits were crossed and we just kind of briefly remembered it and got angry out of nowhere, right? It
Mhm.
seems. And it's like, oh no, there is something that happened that is making me angry.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about is the way memories and associations, particularly from the past, like can happen outside of conscious awareness or even in the present, with leading to a sense that feelings are happening for no reason because we don't know what happened. We're not usually consciously aware of what got set off.
Right. And with, for instance, sometimes we have like a really strong emotional responses that do seem to come out of nowhere. And sometimes that's because there's something traumatic that's been triggered, right?
Yes.
And trauma is stored in our brains in a way that isn't always connected to time and place.
Hmm.
And so sometimes really powerful emotions that seem out of nowhere may be a response to some kind of trauma. Um, Often it's just like our mind is moving more quickly, and we're not noticing the connections there. Always, if we're feeling a strong emotion, something triggered it.
Yeah.
It's a response to something, and taking that step back to notice, what is this emotion? What am I feeling? Can I trace what I'm responding to? And if I can't, then this means this is something outside of my conscious mind, and I may need a little help with this, with figuring
Yeah.
out what's going on here.
Absolutely. And I want to give an example here. I know when I was younger, I would often feel the emotion of sadness or loss come up as the weather turned warmer,
Mm.
as we were approaching summer. And I think for a long time, I thought, oh, I just summer makes me kind of sad or depressed. And it took me a while to realize that it was the end of the school year and the changes and the transition that would come with that every year that I was experiencing a sense of loss. And
Mhm.
so I would sort of equate warm weather with sadness when actually the sadness was coming from the ending of a school year and transitioning into something new. Of course, I didn't know all this when I was younger, but reflecting back, I can see the connection there.
Right. And so as adults, we can recognize if I'm having a strong emotional response and I'm not sure what it is, I need to do a little exploring.
Yes,
Rather than believing this myth that emotions just happen for no reason and then we're missing something.
we're
And
missing
that
something.
emotion is probably going to keep coming back. And
Yes.
so we want to be a little bit more curious about it.
Unless, in my case, you move across the country to a place like the San Francisco Bay Area where there is no summer. So now I don't have to feel that anymore. Solve that problem.
So yeah, I guess that is another possibility is
Another
move across the country or across the world. So, um,
that's one of the main skills we actually teach. Just leave.
just move
Right.
when all else fails.
Fails. Yeah. So the next one are emotion myth number 7. Let me back up because the first 6 emotional myths that we just talked about have a lot to do with control or fear of being out of control around emotions. So I just want to recap what they were. So the first one was having strong emotions means I'm out of control. 2, if I start crying, I will never stop. 3, I need to push down my anger or it will become dangerous. 4, if I'm feeling very emotional, I must do something to change it. 5, reason is better than emotion, or another way of saying this, it's always better to be rational than emotional. And the last one we talked about, number 6, emotions can happen for no reason. And then the next few we're going to talk about they have a little bit of a different flavor. These myths are more about equating emotions with the truth of who you are. So conflating emotions and your identity. So number 7 related to this is I am my emotions. And the truth is, each of us is so much more than our emotions, even if we're really emotional or highly sensitive people. And because our emotions are constantly in flux, it's really hard to have a stable sense of self when we attach our identity to our emotions because they're always changing. And it's not uncommon to feel more than one emotion at once. So you can be angry and sad at the same time over the same thing. And if you are hinging your identity on your emotions, and that's the myth of I am my emotions, that unstable sense of self is really going to trip you up at times.
Yeah, I think that when for those of us who do have strong emotions and have always had maybe stronger emotions than others, we can develop a sense that like being a very highly emotional person is my identity. This is who I am. And then to say like if I'm just an angry person, or
Yeah.
I'm just a very depressed sad person, right? And the reality is that when we hold that idea, we are really missing a lot of our lives and a lot of who we are, all the different aspects of our identity, and focusing on one thing to the exclusion of others. So
Yes.
maybe focusing on one emotion, anger, to the exclusion of all the other emotions we feel strongly. Or the fact that we have a lot of strong emotions and saying that's who I am when there's so many more aspects to ourselves. So being able to recognize emotions are part of who we are rather than just conflating it all together and ignoring other important parts of our identity.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you.
And the eighth myth that we wanted to talk about today is the idea that it's inauthentic to try to change or question my emotions. And so we've spent a lot of time talking about how emotions are triggered by something. They give us information. It's usually helpful to just notice the emotion and let it be rather than try to push it away or change it. And of course, in DBT, we have a whole skill called opposite action around changing our emotional response. um, so with DBT, the beauty of it is that everything fits. Like, so we can put a lot of emphasis on don't try to change your emotions, just let them be, and then say, or try to change your emotions. Um, so when we get into talking about opposite action and noticing if I'm having a strong emotion that maybe isn't really tied to what's going on in the moment. So I'm feeling really angry, but it's about something from a long time ago and it's not about the present. Acting on that anger is probably not going to be effective for us. So we might want to do the opposite, do something different, right? So maybe laugh or joke as a way to not just go with an emotion that maybe isn't going to be helpful to us. And when we get into this idea of maybe do something different, people often say that feels inauthentic, it feels fake. To
Hmm.
try to be happy when I'm feeling really sad, or to try to be joking when I'm really, really angry. Uh,
Yeah.
and in DBT, what we're really always looking for is what's effective. What's going to get us where we want to go? What's going to keep us moving in the direction we're trying to go in our lives? So if every time I feel angry, I act on that anger, and sometimes I'm angry about stuff from the distant past and not the present. So I'm yelling at somebody at work when really I'm angry about stuff that happened when I was in school 20 years ago, right? That's not going to be effective. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's valuable to notice our emotions and also notice where is this emotion coming from? If this emotion is not coming from the present, or if I don't really know where this emotion is coming from, but it's not probably going to be effective to express it right now, changing it is the most authentic thing we can do. Trying
Yeah.
to do something different is actually really authentic because it's saying this emotion maybe doesn't fit in the moment, and I want to do something that's going to be effective.
Yeah. And the emotion we might feel in the moment doesn't necessarily fit our goals and our values. So if we are really scared to go on a job interview, if you feel it's inauthentic to change your emotion, maybe you're not going to show up for that interview, but you have bills to pay. And in that case, your best bet is to try to work on changing your emotion, reducing your fear so you can show up and achieve your goals. And I think that people who struggle with, or folks who really believe that it's wrong or inauthentic to change their emotions, can buy into the myth we talked about a moment ago, number 7, which is I am my emotions. Because if you are your emotions, if that is the truth of who you are, then of course it's going to be inauthentic to try to change your emotions because you feel like you're going against your deepest essence. And so we are really trying to uncouple that or challenge that idea that our emotions are saying the truth of who we are. and that they're always to be trusted.
Right.
Because as you said also that in DBT, it's sort of the both and. So yes, certainly many times there are things about our emotions to listen to and pay attention to. There can be wisdom there. And other times there just isn't. And trying to change our emotions is much more effective. For example, I have a fear of driving up hills. And
Okay.
so yes, I do. So I live in
The
San
wrong
Francisco.
city.
This creates a huge problem. So if I thought, well, I am my emotions, so I'm really scared to drive up the hills, so I'm just not going to, which I have tried, it creates a lot of problems.
I imagine you driving all over the Bay Area trying to avoid hills to get from point A to point B.
I have tried that. And I have a friend who is scared of driving through tunnels, which thankfully there's not as many tunnels,
Right.
but there are a few. And so, if we're going to go with the strong or authentic to try to change those fears or phobias, both myself and my friend, it's going to be super hard to get places.
Right.
So that would be an example of a time when it's actually much more authentic to work on changing the emotion because it's more in line with how I want to live.
Right. And that's an example of where, emotions don't always fit the facts of the situation, right? And they're giving us information, right? And so sometimes we sit with the emotion, sometimes we feel the emotion and let it pass. Sometimes we act on that emotion and forcefully speak to someone to kind of express that anger. And sometimes we change the emotion and do something that's going to be more effective so that when it comes to emotions, there isn't an always or never. It's
Mhm.
really about being thoughtful in our approach to the emotions.
Yeah, and flexible.
Yeah.
So, myth number 9, moving on, is again, these are all kind of different nuances. I am my emotions, which was number 7. Number 8 was it's inauthentic to try to change or question my emotion. Number 9 is something we've already talked about, but my emotions speak the absolute truth. My emotions are the end all be all of what is true. Sometimes strong emotions are based on our interpretations of events rather than the event itself, which is exactly what we were talking about a moment ago. My interpretation of driving over the hills is that somehow gravity is going to suck me back down. It's nonsensical, certainly. So, but here I would say that my strong emotion or my fear is not based on facts of what's actually happening. It's based on interpretation or assumption. And this is a way that our emotions don't always speak the absolute truth. And so, especially if you're very sensitive or you're highly emotional, it can be really hard to challenge this idea that just because you feel something doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah, I think, and that's what we look at when we're talking about emotions in DBT is, does this emotion fit the facts of the situation? Because sometimes it doesn't. And our skill of non-judgmentalness when it comes to mindfulness reminds us that we often have interpretations, assumptions, judgments about situations that are our own creation. It isn't the situation itself. It isn't the person itself. It isn't the emotion itself,
Yeah.
but it's our interpretation of that. And if my interpretation is based on faulty logic, then it is not going to give me effective options.
Yeah. And we'll talk about in a future episode. We've already mentioned opposite action, but the skill that precedes opposite action is check the facts.
Hmm.
So, what we're discussing here is really a checking the facts because believing that our emotions speak the absolute truth is assuming that our emotions are reflecting what is actually happening. And it's not always.
Right, right. And then our 10th and final myth that we wanted to talk about today is I need to be very emotional to be creative. Oftentimes, people who are naturally creative find that that comes from their ability to express strong emotion. And I think it's an extreme statement to say that being creative requires being very emotional, having strong emotions, maybe having kind of out of control or overwhelming emotions. There are plenty of people who are extremely creative that have strong emotions that they manage.
Hmm.
They're not emotionally all over the place. And so I think that, in DBT, we always want to be careful of the extremes So I need to be very emotional to be creative is kind of an extreme statement. Sure, emotions help creativity, but we don't need to be really emotional. We don't need to be overwhelmed with emotion in order to be creative.
And as a matter of fact, even though strong emotion can be great fodder for creative material, it can really be generative. If we don't have a reasonable or rational mind on board, that song is never going to get written. That painting will never get done. You'll never write that short story on emotions alone.
Right. Right. Yeah, I definitely have, worked with people who have like lots of creative ideas that come from an experience of strong emotions, and their struggle is they have to sit down and somehow express that. They have to get it on paper. They have to put something together. They have to meet with people in order to get that creative idea out there. And so we do need that balance in order to let our creativity flow.
And I think that this last myth around needing to be very emotional to be creative can fuel self destructive behavior in creative folks. So, reaching for substances or being more chaotic. And under the premise that that is the basis of a creative life. And it's, as we discussed, it doesn't help with the carry through, and it's certainly not sustainable. It really burns people out.
Right. So with all of these, we're always looking for balance. That we need to strike a balance, and that if we're in some sort of extreme in our thinking or in our actions, we want to notice that and come back to the middle.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for being here with me again today, Ed, to challenge some of these common emotional myths.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. To learn more, or if you're in the Bay Area and want to get started with therapy, you can find us online at bayarea.dbtcc.com. That's bayarea.dbtcc.com.